Hey, what's up guys, it's BenBonk, and welcome back to the 41st Slimekeep Devlog. In this devlog, I added a bunch of lore rooms and started working on music systems in the game. Also, if you're new here, Slimekeep is a fast-paced roguelike where you must kill and capture slimes to stop the corruption that has infected your land. Without further ado, let's get into it. So to start off, I tried experimenting with a bit of new polish for the game. The first of which, having these bullet shells have a chance to stick to the ground after shooting instead of just always disappearing like they used to. Overall, I thought the effect could be a nice addition, but I got quite a bit of feedback from my Discord server about how people weren't too huge fans of this change, so I ended up just reverting it to the old system of them not having a chance to stick, but let me know what you guys think. Continuing on adding bits of polish though, I added these little puddles of slime goop that spawn after slimes jump. These puddles will disappear shortly after, but if the slime dies with the puddle active, the puddle will stay there, kind of leaving some residue and change to the room. I think this small change went a long way, but switching gears for a second, Rookrack in my Discord server made this flashy and really cool casino sign, which was way better than the previous solution. So with his permission, I got to update the casino, and boom, it looks way better now. Anyways, let's get back to adding more polish and variety to the rooms in the game, as I'll be honest, that was one of the biggest critiques I had of the game so far, and it's something that I really wanted to focus on for a while. A few members in the community always liked the idea of adding pits to rooms, and while I was initially hesitant, I eventually gave in and decided to make this pit tile set, which I think surprisingly turned out better than I thought. I then started programming the logic for these pits, and shortly after, I made this test pit, where once a player walked into it, they would fall down and take 1 damage. Then came the very tedious process of going through every room in the game and manually adding these pits. This took quite a while, but by the end, I think this addition turned out great. And if you're wondering, you can actually dash over these pits, which I think is nice. Back on the topic of slimes though, I worked on making slimes squish even more than they used to when they jumped and landed to really sell their squishy feeling, which I think helped a bunch. I also wasn't a huge fan about how slimes used to take damage with this kind of jarring yellow flash effect, so I modified it to be more like how bosses in the game take damage, with a sort of fade in and fade out flash effect. I think it was a definite improvement, but something that also needed improvements in the game was the story/lore. I got tons of comments asking about this in past videos, and I'll admit I've always kind of put off lore. Until now, that is. Look, we all know that the Slime King is bad and ruined the lives of slimes living in Slimetopia. But why is he bad? How did he come to power? What specifically has he done to hinder the lives of slimes? These are the questions I wanted to make sure to answer. And to do this, I decided to direct out some ideas for what I call lore rooms, which occasionally spawn and slowly reveal the story and truth behind Slimetopia if the player can put together the pieces. You can see some of my ideas here, but don't get too excited because I didn't end up adding all of these. But one of them that I did end up deciding to add was the library room. Here, the player could read various books that reveal information about the Slime King and his past. So to start off, I worked on this bookshelf sprite, which was really the core of this room. After a bit, I finished up these sprites and set the whole library room. I also made this library keeper, who has a bit of random dialogue that you can encounter if you get close to him. But now it's time to make the actual books for this library. I got to coding the interactions, and shortly after, I got it so that there would be an exclamation mark bobbing up and down over a section of the bookshelf. And if the player interacted well near that exclamation mark, this blank screen would pop up. Then, after presumably reading the book, once a player left the trigger area, the exclamation mark would fade away, kind of indicating that the player read the book. But if they walk by that same area, the exclamation mark would reappear, giving the player to read the book again if they would like. Now for the actual books, I mostly borrowed the code from the pre-existing Book of Slime pause menu, and so now these books would pop up and were actually interactable, which was pretty neat. So with this logic in place, it was time to actually draft up some ideas for the actual books. Now, I wanted to make quite a bit of variety for what these books could actually contain, so the process took quite a while. But I think I made some great progress lore-wise, which I won't spoil, so you'll just have to find these books in the game yourself. Then came the process of setting up all these books in-game, which took a few days, but eventually the library was pretty much done. The player is now able to read anywhere from 2 to 4 books when encountering the library, but there are a total of 10 books in the collection which can randomly spawn. So the player will have to revisit the library multiple times if they want to read every book. I like this way of doing things as I think it allows for the player to slowly understand and grasp everything. So yeah, let me know what you guys think. Moving on to the next lore room, here I went for a bit of a more standard graveyard. There's nothing too crazy lore-wise here, but the player can visit various gravestones and pay respect to some of the fallen residents of Slimetopia. But the next and final lore room for now that I planned was another big one information-wise. And this lore room was Billy's, or more specifically, Billy's Bar/Tavern. That's right, first it was casinos, and now it's officially adding drinking into Slimekeep. Well, don't worry because they don't drink alcohol at Billy's, but rather slime juice. And actually, on second thought, that may be worse because I don't think you want to know how slime juice is made. Anyways, I set up Billy's in-game, and I really like this outside animation I made. I also made it so that the player could enter the bar, although I still need to set the inside area. So that's what I did. First, I had some of the core decor, such as tables, booths, and the bar area. This was a good start, but the whole tavern area still looked pretty plain, so I added a bunch of drinks to the tables and decorations to the back wall, which I think turned out great. But next up, this bar was looking pretty empty, so I created a bunch of NPCs to liven things up. Now, with all these NPCs made, I wanted the player to be able to talk to all of them and have the actual residents of Slimetopia share their experiences and how the corruption has affected them. And this sounded like a cool idea. But the issue is, I don't have a dialogue system for Slimekeep. Sure, there's this bit of dialogue, if you could call it that, with the shopkeeper, but nothing that allows for interactive questioning. So I spent the next few days crafting a simple custom dialogue solution. On paper, my goal for this dialogue system was to allow the player to use the digit keys or numpad on their keyboard to ask a question to an NPC. The NPC will then display their answer, and the player will be able to ask another question. Now, it wasn't this simple to make unfortunately, but after a few days I did have a basic test up and working. Here, the player can walk up to the bartender and a question will pop up next to him. Upon pressing the 1 key, the camera zooms in and the NPC starts speaking with this cool dialogue bubble and a nice typing effect. And by the way, you should totally do what the bartender says and wishlist Slimekeep on Steam. It really helps with the Steam algorithm and would mean a lot to me if you did so. Link is in the description. But back to the dialogue, as you saw, I also ended up adding the ability for these answers to be broken up into multiple lines, if that makes any sense. Because A, I anticipated some answers to be pretty long and not be able to fit into the small text box, and B, hey, I think it helps a lot to have big chunks of text broken into these smaller bubbles, one chunk at a time. Anyways, this felt like a great start. And if you're wondering, this system kind of works by having each NPC have a list of dialogue options, which was a basic custom class I made with a question field as well as an array of strings for the answer chunks to that specific question. This was nice because this system was pretty flexible this way, and hypothetically, I could have NPCs contain hundreds of individual questions and answer chunks to those questions if I wanted to. But now with that done, I spent a ton of time writing all kinds of questions and answers for each NPC, so now they can ask you a bunch of questions which will reveal more about Slimetopia in the process. And hey, you can also play a kind of scuffed darts game with this guy, which I think is pretty neat. I also kind of borrowed from my library concept and limiting information, where each NPC in the tavern has a few core questions that you can always ask them. But they also have a few random questions, which means that you'll have to visit them multiple times to fully read all their dialogue options. Anyways, that's Billy's, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. Okay, now let's switch gears for a bit, because right now there are around 50 total enemy rooms in Slimekeep, 10 for each of the 5 difficulty levels in the game. However, I got a bit of feedback that this was frankly too little, and people would frequently recognize rooms due to how few of them there were. And I'll admit this was definitely true, so I spent the next few days designing a ton more rooms for the game. I started off by laying the foundations for each new room with just the walls and the floors. Then I moved on to adding the inside terrain with these collidable objects. And finally, I added in a bunch of polish with grass, pits, destructible objects, and so on. This ended up taking quite a while overall, but in the end I had around 25 new rooms for the game, which I later ended up increasing to over 30. All I had to do now was set up these rooms with enemies, and boom, now the game's rooms felt like they had way more variety, which really helped. And I mean, at the end of the day, the player will still end up recognizing rooms, but just not as much as before. Next up, I started laying out the foundations for adding music to the game. As some of you may know, I have a few composers working on music for the game, and while they're still finishing up, I figured that they'd made enough progress so far, so I could finally just start setting up the basic implementation of how music will function in the game. Now, my main thing that I wanted to tackle was the concept of day themes, or essentially the music that you'll hear for the majority of the game. You see, one of the Slimekeep composers, Lydiac, who was in charge of these themes, had the really cool idea that the music could change based on where the player was in the game. For example, there is this normal day theme, but then if the player enters their house, the music will seamlessly transition to become more kind of muffled to emulate the feeling of actually being in the house. This sounded awesome, so huge thanks to Lydiac for really coming up with the idea, but this also meant that I had some work to do. First, I made this crossfade day theme function. Essentially, this function would fade out the current track and fade in the new track to be played, while also making sure that the new track coming in starts playing at the same time as the old track left off. So after some basic setup, here you can see that there is a muffled version of this day theme that Lydiac made playing. But once the player steps outside, boom, it seamlessly transitions to the normal day theme. And yeah, this is a brief sample of what some of the music sounds like in the game, so I hope you like it. Anyways, this was a great start, but I ran into the issue where if the player entered and exited the house too quickly, the music would kind of break. This was a bit of a challenge to figure out how to fix, but eventually I just made this check here before crossfading, which mostly fixed the issue. I then started setting up the logic for the rest of the unique tracks that could be faded into. For example, take this dock area, where the music perfectly transitions into a super calm version of the main theme, which I think sounds great. Anyways, I also set up the logic for switching entire day themes, as every 4 days the day theme will change, as well as its variants becoming more corrupted. I don't have much to show here as this music still isn't quite done, but at least I had the system in place to automatically switch themes. Anyways, I also added in this ominous music for the keep area, and music for the corridor area, which Lydiac also made. Then I added this computer theme to the computer, which another one of the composers, Splash, made, as well as his death screen theme, which also ended up having actually 5 variants. Anyways, that's just a bit of a sneak peek of the music for now. I'll make sure to showcase more in the future, but I hope you like what you hear so far. So yeah, that's all I have for this devlog. Hope you liked it, and make sure to consider wishlisting Slimekeep on Steam, and subscribing to the channel if you like these videos. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.